Good evening. This is Professor Rush once again. And this time, and for the next few segments, I'm going to be concentrating on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In this presentation, the first of three, I'm going to be considering the historicity of major players in the Old Testament. That is to say, what evidence do we have for the historical existence of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Joseph, and most importantly, Moses, the major player in the Old Testament Exodus story? Are these real people or part of a storyline designed to give a certain group of people or tribe of people special privileges and land holdings? Before I get started with this, let me say that I do not have much use for the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These traditions do not promote freedom of thought nor the democratic process. They promote slavery and ignorance. Now, I'm referring to traditions and not the people that belong to these particular traditions. To begin, after studying documents connected to Judaism for over 30 years now, my conclusion is that the Old Testament is not history, although reported as such by many academics, especially biblical scholars with a vested interest in proving the historicity of the Bible. The Bible is best described as a historical novel, for there is history in the Old Testament, but this is not the purpose of the document. The Old Testament instead is a mythical charter constructed after 586 BCE as a means of obtaining special privileges and land holdings. We are led to believe by biblical historians that there is a continuity of belief along with documentation that extends from 1800 BCE to the present. This can only be academic opinion, as there's no evidence to support this claim. Moreover, what would pass for Hebrew thought and culture at 1800 BCE would not be the same at 1000 BCE, nor at 500 BCE, or even today. The ancient Egyptians, who maintained a very conservative system, couldn't accomplish such continuity. Now, this is important to understand. Are you ready? The Hebrew priests, following the lead of the ancient Egyptians, truly believed that if you wrote it down, it was fact, or would become fact in time. When the ancient Egyptians painted images of gods in their tombs, they believed these images would jump off the walls and become real, as depicted in the first Mummy movie starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. Even today, people believe that if something is written in a book, especially if written by someone considered important, for example, some academic from Harvard, it must be true. Presentations on the History Channel, because of the name of this channel, that is history, it must be true. Now, as Pharaoh said, remember Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments? He said, "So it is written, so it shall be." Thus the Hebrews maintained this belief. So it is written, so it shall be. Moreover, the historians today are so wrapped up in political correctness that any discussions of biblical history have to be considered with a great deal of caution. And don't blindly accept what I have to say either. But in my opinion, what I have to say is a more realistic story. I can find no credible evidence of documents dated before 800 BCE regarding the tradition of Judaism. What I have discovered is that the major players in most of the Old Testament was written and assembled after 586 BCE, and more properly after 560 BCE, when many Israelites returned from exile in Babylon. Now, let me back up a bit. In 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the Israelites. They couldn't win wars because they couldn't gain allies. They thought everyone else was scum, and very few people would take their side. In any case, out of the many thousands of Israelites available for exile to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar rounded up about 10,000, composed of the elite. This would be 2,000 individuals, including priests and mathematicians and great artisans and so on, and then about 8,000 slaves to work on building projects. Sound familiar? This exile to Babylon is really the first part of the Exodus story sold as historical fact, particularly on the History Channel. The rest, the poor Israelites, stayed in Palestine. Now, around 560 BCE, Cyrus the Great came into Babylon, took over, and told the Israelites to go home and to return to their promised land. This is another part of the Exodus story. Now, at this point, the Israelites, formerly polytheistic, figured that they were worshiping the wrong deities and decided to go for monotheism, probably influenced by the Zoroastrians, as well as events that they were aware of in ancient Egypt. Once the Israelites returned to Palestine in 560 BCE, they recognized that many of the relatives and friends that they had left behind were establishing relationships with others and other Canaanite tribes. In order to stop this and to stop their own men from straying, they developed extreme rules to keep tribal members away from the other Canaanite tribes. All you have to do is read Deuteronomy to get a flavor of this. They established restrictions on foods so that their members couldn't eat with others. They trashed the mother goddess and consequently women and nature. The men were forbidden to go anywhere near the Canaanite temples. So after 560 BCE, they became monotheistic, again to separate themselves from the surrounding polytheistic Canaanites. And they invented a new deity, a demon who demanded absolute obedience. Their storyline begins with Genesis and bits and pieces of stories that are knitted together just as sort of an introduction. For example, the story of Noah, which they picked up there, and that helps us to understand their separation from the other Canaanite tribes. But their real story begins with Abraham. As shown on this map, there are those two areas from which the Jews borrowed and then elaborated their storyline. That is, ancient Sumerian myths when exiled to Babylon from 586 to 560 BCE, again the flood story for example, and then from ancient Egypt, the origin of much of their ritual procedure, the identity of Joseph and Moses, and of course their mind-altering substances, although many of these substances would have been available to them during their 26 years of exile in Babylon. Now, although E.A. Wallace Budge has been maligned by some Egyptologists, his earlier writings are not as tainted by political correctness. And for those who desire to check out some of my conclusions on this point of origin of Jewish ritual and references to the underworld and so on, you can read Budge's The Gods of Ancient Egyptians, volumes 1 and 2. In fact, if you have any questions about anything I say, I will gladly provide references for further reading. Many of my references, by the way, are to be found in my The 12 Gates, Failed God, and The Mushroom in Christian Art. Please excuse the commercial plug, but I see that the Pope is starting to promote his book on Jesus. I'll be curious to see if he references my books and he correctly identifies Jesus as a mushroom. Returning to the slide that gives you some idea of the travels of Abraham, let's first consider Abraham, the grand patriarch of the Hebrew tribe. As you can see, the grayed out area is the route taken by our mythic hero Abraham, a major player in the Old Testament, a scoundrel at large, the man from Ur, who spoke with his patron deity on numerous occasions, suggesting that this is simply a literary device, or perhaps he's psychotic, or a reference to mind-altering substances used extensively in this tradition. Now, Christian art depicts many of the travels of Abraham, and during his travels and this art, we encounter the holy mushroom, the Amanita muscaria. But there are certainly passages in the Old Testament that suggest cannabis and henbane as well. Now, the rabbis don't want to talk about this, but the Old Testament, Zohar, and other writings are full of references to cannabis, mushrooms, mandrake, and all manner of mind-altering substances. Now, in this slide, we can see, now I'm not sure how clear this comes out on YouTube, but we can see here the conical-shaped mushrooms on the table, complete with stalks. There are also mushrooms in the tray. Now, a clearer image and extended discussion of this particular image with Abraham and his wife Sarah is available in The Mushroom in Christian Art that was released in January 2011.